In May 2024, the skies over central Burkina Faso bore witness to a scene that defied belief. As the early sun pierced through the morning haze, military helicopters, proudly waving the national flag, opened their steel doors, not to drop supplies, soldiers, or weapons, but to release something few had imagined: a million-strong swarm of beetles. Not just any beetles, dung beetles. Yes, dung beetles. Why would a government deploy insects from the air as if waging war? Why would a president gamble his nation's dignity on creatures most people crush underfoot? Because the land was dying. Because the livestock boom that was meant to lift the economy had become a curse. Because cow dung blanketed fields like toxic snow, choking rivers, spreading disease and poisoning the soil. And because one man, Ibrahim Traoré, refused to believe that Africa must always reach for foreign hands to fix African problems. Stay tuned. This is not just about bugs. It's about how one man dared to turn ridicule into revolution. Subscribe and walk with us, because Africa deserves leaders who see beneath the surface. In the spring of 2024, Burkina Faso stood on the edge of both promise and peril. The country had committed itself to a bold new direction: massive investment in nomadic livestock farming. Cows, goats, camels, and sheep roamed the central plains in record numbers, the nation's hope tied to their hooves. With every sunrise, herders drove thousands of animals across the savanna, fueling an export-led agricultural boom that promised to rescue the struggling economy. But beneath that boom lay a ticking time bomb. With millions of animals came millions of tons of dung. It piled high across fields, festered underfoot, and clogged the water sources once used by entire communities. Unlike in neighboring ecosystems, central Burkina Faso had few natural decomposers. There were no beetles or insects evolved to break down this scale of organic waste. And so, the very success of the livestock expansion began poisoning the land that supported it. Ministers debated furiously behind closed doors. Some advocated for importing European composting technologies at astronomical cost. Others proposed industrial-scale fertilizer plants, requiring years to build and billions in foreign loans. But all options meant dependence on aid on the West, on systems that had failed Africa before. During one particularly tense cabinet meeting, President Ibrahim Traoré remained silent as arguments escalated. Then, with quiet resolve, he rose and walked to a dusty map pinned on the wall. It showed the Sahel in deep contrast: desert swallowing the north, rainforest clinging to the south, and Burkina Faso suspended precariously in the middle. "We are not just dealing with dung," he said, his voice even but deliberate. "We are dealing with a broken cycle. And cycles are restored not by concrete, but by life." He then uttered words no one expected. "Dung beetles." The room fell into stunned silence. One minister chuckled nervously. Another scoffed openly. The finance minister was speechless. The agriculture minister outright laughed. And within hours, opposition members took to social media, mocking the proposal. "Our president thinks insects will save the economy." International media joined in. Western outlets ran headlines like, "While the world builds AI, Burkina Faso drops bugs." The ridicule was sharp, patronizing, and global. But what no one knew was that Traoré had already spent months laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most daring ecological experiments of the century. He had secretly consulted with ecologists from South Africa, Kenya, and even Australia, countries where dung beetles had transformed ranching landscapes. With their help, Burkina Faso's military and scientists began breeding colonies of beetles, each chosen for compatibility with the Sahelian ecosystem. And so, by early May, in the dead of night, wooden crates clattered into helicopters on the tarmac at Ouagadougou's airbase. Inside them, nearly a ton of beetles, millions of industrious insects, bred not for study, but for war. Not against an enemy, but against decay, against disease, against degradation. At dawn, the helicopters roared over the central plateau, doors flung open as the crates were unlocked. What followed seemed surreal. Swarms of beetles falling from the sky, tumbling through the morning light, descending not in chaos but in purpose. They hit the ground and immediately began to work, clinging to piles of dung, digging, rolling, burying, restoring. To the astonished farmers watching from below, it was nothing short of magic. Within days, the familiar stench began to fade. The thick crust of waste that had coated their fields began to vanish, replaced by moist, aerated soil. Grass returned where only dryness had reigned. In the village of Kougou, a 70-year-old herdsman stood speechless before his field and finally said, "I have seen many things, But never this. The beetle drop was only the beginning. Traoré had not just addressed an ecological problem, he had made a point. While others reached for billion-dollar solutions, he had reached for the earth. Where others imported machines, he imported insects. Where others sought control, he sought renewal. But as the beetles disappeared beneath the soil, something far greater began to surface. The morning after the beetle release, central Burkina Faso awoke to a silence that was not absence, but change. Gone was the buzzing cloud of flies that usually hovered over every cattle enclosure. The smell, long considered an unavoidable part of rural life, was fading. Something had shifted. Within 48 hours, the beetles had buried thousands of kilos of dung. Their instinctive movements, rolling, tunneling, hiding the waste deep in the soil, set in motion a chain reaction. The earth, once hardened by neglect, became porous. Moisture held longer. Roots began to push back into the dirt. And for the first time in months, pastures no longer looked like battlegrounds, but meadows. And yet the emotional turning point came not from data, but from a farmer's eyes. In the outskirts of Cotonou, an old herder wept as he knelt beside a beetle busily working under a cow. "It's only a bug," he whispered, "but it saved my land. It saved my children's future." These words spread faster than any headline. Across the Sahelian villages, rumors gave way to observation. Herders noticed fewer cases of hoof rot. Cattle grazed without stumbling through piles of dung. Children could run across fields barefoot again. Women in Wahuya reported markets free from swarms of disease-spreading flies. The beetles had not only removed waste, they had returned dignity. Yet not everyone was convinced. In Ouagadougou, members of Traoré's government gathered in tense meetings. Some argued that the beetles were unpredictable, that they might become invasive or disturb local ecology. Others feared ridicule from foreign governments. Whispers began to circulate that this was another strongman experiment, the kind Africa had seen before, led by populist leaders chasing glory through reckless gambles. And in the Western press, the backlash was swift. "Burkina Faso risking ecological disaster," read one headline. "President trades policy for performance," said another. American think tanks warned of unintended consequences. European agricultural lobbies accused Traoré of sabotaging regional trade norms by promoting unregulated biological interventions. A senior analyst on French television scoffed. He dropped bugs from helicopters. What next, frogs to end drought? But Traoré did not flinch. He answered not with argument, but with facts. Within 10 days, Burkina Faso's Ministry of Agriculture published the first satellite imagery showing visibly greener belts in central grazing zones. Rural clinics recorded a 20% drop in fly-borne illnesses. Soil samples showed higher nitrogen levels, a key indicator of fertility. And perhaps most telling, local veterinarians reported healthier livestock across nearly every village touched by the beetle operation. The international media began to shift its tone. Could this be Africa's most sustainable ecological intervention? Asked a Kenyan broadcaster. Brazilian soil scientists called the project a model for arid land restoration. And on the streets of Bamako and Niamey, young activists painted murals of beetles beside the face of Ibrahim Traoré, transforming the humble insect into a symbol of defiance. But Traoré was not interested in symbols alone. He knew that for real change to take root, it must reach into the fabric of politics. So he called a public forum in Ouagadougou. Farmers, scientists, economists, and students were invited to speak freely. And at its close, Traoré stood and said, "They laughed. Let them. While they build artificial intelligence, we are restoring ancient intelligence. The wisdom of soil, the rhythm of cycles, the truth that nature never forgets. If beetles can work for us, perhaps the world can begin to see Africa not as a problem to fix, but as a teacher to learn from." The hall erupted, not in applause, but in pride. Still, not everyone believed the beetle miracle would last. Weeks passed, and the effects of the beetle release continued to unfold, not in dramatic headlines, but in the quiet rhythms of everyday life. In the villages of central Burkina Faso, people began to breathe easier, literally. The once choking stench of manure, ever present in homes and corrals, had dissipated. Ruined fields that had been abandoned were now returning to green. Shallow wells that had turned brown and brackish cleared with the absence of runoff from animal waste. The signs were unmistakable. Fewer fevers, fewer flies, healthier children. At local health centers, nurses recorded a 30% drop in cases of fly-borne infections like conjunctivitis and diarrhea. Veterinarians reported fewer skin diseases among cattle. Markets once plagued by swarms of insects regained their vibrancy. In Wahuya, a cooperative of women farmers began referring to the beetles as the little black doctors. Economic life, too, began to transform. With the soil rejuvenated, grasses grew thicker and richer. This meant better grazing and less need to migrate herds across vast distances. Livestock gained weight faster, leading to increased meat and milk production. Local traders recorded stronger demand from regional buyers, especially from Niger and Côte d'Ivoire. For the first time in years, central Burkina Faso had a surplus, not just of meat, but of fodder and grain. The country began to export again. But one of the most significant effects was psychological. Young men who had previously dreamt of leaving the village now saw value in staying. They saw that the land could provide. Agricultural schools began filling with new applicants. Sons and daughters of herders who once scorned farming now returned to study soil science. In the village of Dano, teachers began integrating beetle biology into classroom lessons, not as a novelty, but as part of national identity. Still, not everyone celebrated. Within government circles, a quiet rebellion brewed, especially among the elites who had built their fortunes importing chemical fertilizers from Europe and China. For decades, Burkina Faso had spent millions in foreign reserves purchasing synthetic products to maintain its soil. These contracts were lucrative, protected by kickbacks and backroom deals. But now, with natural regeneration underway, demand had plummeted, and the anger turned personal. Some accused Ibrahim Traoré of waging economic sabotage. Others whispered that he had overstepped, making agricultural policy from the sky, without consultation, with too much theater and too little accountability. One parliamentarian fumed, "He's building a cult, not a country. What happens when the Beatles fail?" But Traoré knew better. He had seen this before. The fear of lost profit masked as concern for the people. So he addressed the accusations in public, standing not in a government chamber, but in the heart of a village square. There are those who say I acted alone. They are right. I acted alone because the people were alone, choking on filth while others dined in hotels. I did not ask permission to serve my nation. I acted because the land was crying and the people were ignored. His words struck deep. Because the people knew they were true. The political calculation was simple. While the capital debated, the countryside thrived. While businessmen lobbied for sanctions against the Beetle Initiative, rural communities flourished. The more they tried to paint Traoré as reckless, the more ordinary people saw him as courageous. By the end of June, over a dozen farmers' unions had issued public statements in support of the president. "Let the beetles spread," one declaration read, "and let those who profited from our misery go silent." And amidst it all, a new phrase began circulating on the radio, in WhatsApp groups, and in church sermons. "If a beetle can save our soil, what else have we been ignoring?" If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. Yet as success spread, global powers began to feel threatened. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the beetle campaign stirred reactions far more complex than admiration. At first, the international media treated it as a curiosity, an African oddity to be filed under the bizarre and unusual. But as the results became undeniable, the tone shifted from amusement to unease. Because what Ibrahim Traoré had done was not just ecological, it was geopolitical. In Washington, analysts on West Africa raised concerns. If Burkina Faso could independently restore its ecosystems, what else might it do without foreign assistance? Think tanks began questioning whether this biological autonomy would inspire other African nations to follow suit, turning away from Western-backed development models. In Paris, the reaction was sharper. French fertilizer exporters lobbied their government to engage diplomatically before the beetle movement undermined regional trade. One executive was quoted in Le Monde as saying, "If every African country starts going natural, our industry collapses." In Beijing, the unease was economic. China had spent years establishing agricultural trade routes across the Sahel. If local solutions like beetles replaced synthetic imports, billions in expected contracts would evaporate. Officials began quietly pushing offers of loans and technical partnerships to draw Burkina Faso back into dependence. And yet Traoré stood firm. He made no grand accusations. Instead, he presented evidence. He invited delegations from Kenya, Ethiopia, and Ghana to observe the beetle zones. He gave international journalists full access to affected areas. And then he went one step further. He addressed the African Union. Dressed not in a suit, but in traditional Faso Danfani cloth, Traoré stood before the assembly and spoke not of insects, but of mindset. "We have been told for generations," he said, "that African problems require foreign solutions. that we must borrow to feed our children, that we must wait for outside approval before we act. But the land does not wait. The rains do not wait, and our people can wait no longer. He paused, then raised a clump of dark, aerated soil taken from a once dead field in central Burkina Faso. This is not magic. It is biology. It is common sense. It is ours. The hall erupted, not with diplomatic applause, but with roaring agreement. Delegates from Niger, Mali, Chad, and even South Africa stood to salute. In that moment, the beetles were no longer insects. They were symbols of African capability, of ecological sovereignty, of a continent reclaiming its narrative, not with noise, but with results. And so the world watched as a beetle became the front line of Africa's sovereignty. With the central plateau of Burkina Faso revitalized, President Ibrahim Traoré turned his gaze northward, towards the Sahel's harsh edge, where the desert creeps year by year, swallowing villages and driving families from their ancestral lands. The beetle campaign had proven one thing: nature, when respected and understood, could be a force of recovery. Now Traoré aimed to scale that lesson across the continent. His new initiative was simple, yet bold. Extend the beetle-based restoration deeper into arid zones. Couple it with solar-powered water pumps and community-led irrigation. Establish rural cooperatives that could maintain, monitor, and expand soil recovery using native species. In essence, build an ecological shield across the middle of Burkina Faso, a living wall against desertification. But the vision did not end at national borders. Traoré called on neighboring nations to create a shared restoration corridor, a transnational zone where science, indigenous knowledge, and biology work together. From Senegal to Sudan, the aim was to replace decades of donor-funded projects with locally driven, self-sustaining ecosystems. To the skeptics, it sounded like utopia. To the people who had seen their land reborn, it sounded like destiny. In the village of Yargo, a young herder named Fusini summed it up best. If the beetles can live from our soil, so can we. We were told we are too poor. But our ground is not poor. It was just buried. Now it breathes again. This is what Ibrahim Traoré understood. That soil health was not just about agriculture. It was about sovereignty. A nation that can feed itself, restore itself, and trust its own ecosystems is a nation no longer at the mercy of distant banks or foreign corporations. As global debates raged on about climate funding, carbon credits, and high-tech solutions, Burkina Faso had quietly built a model of low-cost, high-impact transformation, without debt, without dependency. But more than a policy, Traoré's approach became a belief system. He urged African schools to teach environmental science rooted in local ecosystems. He pushed for trade deals that rewarded sustainable farming, not just raw exports. And he challenged young Africans to become guardians of the ground, scientists, farmers, and leaders who see the soil as sacred. Because as he often said, Africa will not rise from the top down. It will rise from the ground up. But if one beetle can carry the weight of a nation's hope, what else might we reclaim? In the heart of West Africa, a nation once dismissed for its struggles has rewritten the rules of recovery, not through wealth or weapons, but through wisdom and will. With a single act that many called absurd, Ibrahim Traoré transformed a national crisis into a global conversation. The beetle drop was never just about insects. It was about trust. Trust in the land, in the knowledge of our elders, in the rhythms of nature long overlooked by those who chase speed over sustainability. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer wait for permission to thrive, that it would not be shackled by aid, by contracts drawn in distant capitals, or by a story written without its voice. And so the dung beetle became more than a creature. It became a compass, a symbol of how nations can dig deep, bury what poisons them, and build fertility from decay. It reminded a continent that sovereignty begins not with declarations, but with dirt, not with speeches, but with soil that breathes again. From those tiny wings and tireless claws emerged a political doctrine far greater than any white paper, that ecological dignity is national dignity. Now the fields of central Burkina Faso grow green where waste once rotted. Livestock flourish, children play freely, and the world watches not in mockery, but in awe. This is the vision that Ibrahim Traoré has dared to plant, a future where Africa rises not in imitation of others, but in honor of itself, where development does not mean dependency, and where the most unlikely allies, like beetles, can lead the charge for restoration, resilience, and respect. If this story shakes something deep in your soul, don't scroll past. Like, share, and let your voice be heard. Subscribe, because no one will tell our truth if we do not. What do you see when you look at the land beneath your feet? Is it waste? Or is it waiting? Comment below. Africa rise. Ibrahim did it right. Soil is power, you knew Africa. Burkina Faso shows the way. It's time we listen to the land.